Okay, so now we're testing, and we're having an interview with Per Nordlöf, who is a professional computer programmer, and he has chosen the platform D because it has, for many reasons, it has a good community, and it also has some philosophy called design by introspection. So now we're going to hear from Per what this actually means. So Per, can you talk a little bit about this way of designing by introspection?
Okay, so the term design by introspection was coined by one of the co-founders of the D language, namely Andrei Alexandrescu. And it's a relatively recent term. I think he made it up a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And he makes an analogy with nanotechnology. And more specifically, the idea behind the term is that today many programmers are confronted with different special cases of code that when you look at it from a little bit of distance, it's actually code that builds up complicated processes or complicated algorithms, but the parts are not that complicated. But when you put them together, everything becomes complicated. And design by introspection strives to make this burden of manually assembling different pieces of code together smaller for the programmer, and it puts the programmer in a position where he can make the language or the compiler cooperate with him in this assembly process. So it's a little bit difficult to explain in detail what this means without having any code in front of you. Or so I'm just talking with a very from the background of being a typically unskilled programmer who just wants to get the concept of these things. And if you want to be more, you want to have more details, you can dive into the subject.
Sure. Can I just ask you a question then, because I'm one of those unskilled programmers, I guess.
Yeah.
Did I understand correctly then that to do design by introspection, you have to have a kind of insight into how the compiler works? So, in some way.
Yeah, you have to actually, you don't have to understand the code in the compiler, but you have to understand how the language works, and you have to understand the concept of something that's called the metaprogramming. The term metaprogram is quite an old term, and I think it was coined in the 1960s or something. And the idea behind the term is that when you speak about meta, you mean something that's in different levels. And metaprogramming means that you have some kind of logic that you write that in terms assembles logic. So normally when we speak about programming, we have data and we have code. And we write the code to process the data. But the guys who thought about this in the 1960s, among others, John McCarthy, who was the founder of Lisp, he thought about making this thing even more generic, the concept of programming, making it even more hierarchical or high level. So he made up the term, or one of his co-workers or co-fellows made up the term metaprogramming, which means that you have code that not only processes and outputs data, but also processes and outputs code. And this this is an idea or a concept that is very underused today, because many programmers or literature writers don't make their homework. They don't think about what has already been done and why it was done. So today we have complicated languages that that can be mostly processed by humans and not by code. But it's much better if you can have a programmer that can kind of automate his own process of developing code inside the code itself. And Lisp is one of the languages which makes this as easy as possible. So it's not built for this object-oriented programming in the terms we use it today, but it's built for writing code that can process its own code. And design by introspection is kind of similar in concept, that it tries to write logic that can assemble code automatically, not completely process code, but it can more cleverly and automatically assemble different smaller, simplistic parts of your code into more complicated code. And it does this at compile time instead of runtime, which Lisp does. And the whole meaning of making it at the compile time is that you can make optimizations that is not possible in other languages currently with this kind of process. So you can make code very generic and kind of self-assembling, and also extremely fast, probably in the future faster than C++ can do it. But now we're on par with C++, but in a couple of years I predict that they will be even make things faster than you can do in C++. So it's kind of similar to the concept of metaprogram, but it's happening at compile time, and it's a little bit more restricted, but it strives to make the process of putting code together to make simpler parts put together automatically. So if I give an example of a more concrete description, you could take, for instance, the fact that you have different kinds of sorting algorithms. You have different kinds of merge algorithms that create unions of data. You have different kinds of search algorithms. And they are different because they operate on different kinds of data. Depending on how data is stored in memory, different algorithms are more suitable. And the idea is that much of this information about how data is stored in memory can be shown to the language and in turn to the compiler, so the compiler can make decisions on its own on which algorithm it should choose depending on how the data is stored in memory. So this tries to expose more information about how data is structured in memory and feed that to the compiler, so the compiler can do more clever choice automatically of algorithms and optimizations. So that, I think, is the whole idea behind design by introspection.
Okay. So at this point, I'm still kind of thinking that this design by introspection, it's kind of you're introspecting in a way that you really understand how the computer is operating, and then you design your program based on this very deep knowledge. Would you agree on that?
Yes, I agree on the idea that that more information about how data is stored and how how data can be processed and in alternative ways is exposed in more detail to the compiler, and in turn to first of all into the language, which itself exposes this information to the compiler that assembles the real machine code. So it doesn't expose everything, but it exposes enough of things to make this self-assembly possible. And there are plans to expose more and more information. For instance, another concept is very much discussed now is how memory should be managed. If it should be managed more automatically with something like garbage collection, or it should be managed by manual memory like in C, C++. And the problem is actually more about how to expose as much information as possible about how memory is used and reclaimed in the language itself. And there are lots of things to do here in that domain. So there are more possibilities to make the concept of memory handling even more automatically and at the same time fast. That is currently under investigation in the development process. So it's all about exposing more information about how data is structured and how data is processed, but not in every detail currently. And I don't think we want to expose every detail to the programmer. We want to expose every detail to the compiler, but not to the programmer.
All right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it kind of confirms that I'm on the right track somehow. And for me, it's like, because I come from a more of a psychology or a philosophy way of thinking about these things, and my intention is to bridge a little bit the concepts of science and philosophy that are more kind of understandable by a human mind, and this what you call design by introspection. If you don't mind, I'm just going to tell you the word introspection from a philosophical point of view kind of means you're looking inwards and you're sensing into your mind, so to speak. Kind of like in a meditation. And I'm curious about, because so far I have not really understood why it's called design by introspection in D. Because if I can just summarize what I understood so far, it's kind of like when I do design by introspection as a programmer, I am thinking in hierarchies, and I'm thinking about how I can help the machine to create some a code. Basically, I write a program, and then the computer program that I write is going to somehow give a response that is on the same level as it's also a program, so to speak. And I don't really understand then why they choose to call it design by introspection. Would you speculate a little bit on that, kind of the philosophical background?
Yeah. I think the term introspection was not chosen by Andrew Alexandrescu. I think it was inherited from other language terminologies. And I'm not sure about the origin of the term introspection used in this context. I do believe it was chosen somewhat to sound a little bit human-like, to perhaps promote it in in an AI context, where you want to make your research sound more like you're building machines that are more complex in nature than they actually are. I'm just guessing right now about the origins of the term. I do think that the term, the semantic meaning of the term in the context of computer science is quite far from the meaning in the context of human thinking. We could say that in a very far in the long term, the concept of design by introspection could be extended even further. But I do believe that something like self-assembling code would be a more descriptive term for it. And perhaps the term is a little bit ill-chosen, I would say. So self-assembling software is perhaps something that's more descriptive. The way the human does introspection is about perhaps reflecting on different ways of thinking and different ways of solving a problem. That's my definition of introspection. Perhaps you have another explanation that you could elaborate on, and I could perhaps adjust the semantic meaning of the terms so you can understand it better in the computer science context.
Well, I think probably reflection would be a really good word for it, because a reflection kind of means that you're looking at your internal world, especially images of the internal world. So you're kind of thinking inside yourself in pictures and images and perhaps introspection, I would say maybe it's pretty passive in a way, whereas you're only observing your inner world.
Yeah.
A reflection can be a little bit more active, that you're actually kind of you're changing the images, and because you're having kind of a more active dialogue. So probably introspection, as I say, will be more of a just gathering information. So that, just my reflection right now. Yeah, I think we've come a bit on the way. At least I feel I have begun to understand what design by introspection means, and that was the goal for this recording. So thank you very much, Per, for your taking your time to explain this. And you're
very welcome.
Cool.
Okay. All right.
Ska vi se, jag har fortfarande lyckats stänga av här. En meeting kan vi säga.
Ska jag ta